The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Welcome. I'm Rupert Keenlyside from Eurofinance, and I'm delighted to host today's webinar, The Dirty Little Secrets About Interchange. Today's presentation will last 20 to 25 minutes, and it will be followed by a Q&A session in which you can post your questions that I'll read out to the presenter. Today's presenter is Dean Leavitt, who's Chairman and CEO of Boost Payment Solutions. As well as being a member of the CPI Global Advisory Board, Dean will also be speaking at the CPI Global Commercial Cards and Payment Summit next month in New York, where the interchange debate will be explored in more detail. Dean is joining our expert panel on B2B supplier enablement. Before I hand over to Dean, he's asked me to read out this brief disclaimer, which I'll go through, and Dean will immediately start his presentation when it's over. Every situation is different, and the information provided today cannot and should not be relied upon as advice for any particular circumstance. Boost Payment Solutions is a private company and is not owned in part or in whole by any bank or card brand or affiliate of either. Some of the information presented may be based solely on the opinion of Boost Payment Solutions or Dean Leavitt, and other payment professionals may have differing opinions on the same topic or different interpretations of the operating rules of any given card brand. Lastly, the information to be presented today pertains primarily to the United States, and the laws and commercial rules guiding electronic payments in other regions around the world may differ significantly. So now, Dean, over to you, and you're online.
Thank you, Rupert, and welcome everybody. Good morning to those here on the East Coast of the United States, and good afternoon to those abroad. So the first thing I'd like to talk about is just generally the ecosystem that Interchange revolves around. There are several key players, and this picture doesn't necessarily depict every single player that's involved in credit card transactions, but it's really the primary players. First, we have the card issuers. They are the financial institutions that actually extend the credit in the case of a credit card or issue the actual cards to the card holder. Then to the right you have the card brands. They are obviously the brands or the marks on the card. And you have MasterCard, Visa, American Express, and Discover as the primary ones we'll talk about today. Then you have the suppliers or vendors, as they're commonly referred to. They're the recipients of the payments we'll talk about. The acquirers and processors are the entities that facilitate the transactions on behalf of the suppliers and vendors. If you think of the card issuers as the financial institutions that create the bridge between card holders and the financial community, the acquirers and processors are the entities that create the bridge between the suppliers and vendors and the financial community. The sponsor banks are the entities with which the acquirers and processors work. They are the acquirers and processors link in and connection to the financial community. And finally, you obviously have the buyers or the card holders. And we're primarily going to talk about business to business today. So we're talking about corporate purchasers. And then lastly, in the center is the Federal Reserve, which is the facilitator of the payments. Once the transactions are authorized and settled, it's the Fed that ultimately moves the dollars around and among the various institutions. Next slide, please. So let's talk a little about what interchange actually is. It's essentially the yield to the issuer of the card for extending the credit to the cardholder. It's essentially the interest. It's typically paid by the recipient of the payment, in this case the supplier. And interestingly, the credit card industry is really, to my knowledge, the only industry where the borrower doesn't necessarily pay the interest. This is typically paid by the supplier or the recipient of the payment. And it's interesting. It applies both to consumer and business, where an example would be you walk into a store, you buy a shirt for let's say $100. You walk out with the shirt. The next day, the retailer receives the funds in their account. And 30 days later, you'll get a bill from your issuing bank saying, please pay in 15 days the full amount. And if you do, you've essentially been extended 45 days of free credit, which is kind of interesting and unique as it relates to the typical borrower and lender relationship. But the same exact concept applies in business to business as it does to the consumer transactions. It's important to note that interchange is really just one component of the supplier's cost of card acceptance. It, in conjunction with assessments, which is paid to the card brand, as well as the acquirer fees, which are paid to the acquirer and the processor. 100% of the interchange goes to the issuing bank. They then, to the extent they have any rebate programs or other types of mileage-based programs in the consumer world, they pay those funds out of the interchange that the issuing bank receives. Next slide, please, Rupert. So what impacts interchange? There are quite a few elements that go into determining ultimately how a transaction is interchanged, but certainly one of the key elements is the card type being used. Is it a debit card? Is it a credit card? Is it a consumer card or business card? Is it issued by a foreign entity? Is it a fleet card? Is there a special mileage program involved? The type of card has a direct impact on the nature of the interchange. The timeliness, certainly as it relates to both consumer and business, the time frame from which a transaction is authorized to when it's ultimately settled also has a direct impact on interchange. In business to business, the transaction size is often paramount, as many of the interchange rates are based on the transaction size, and we'll get into a little more of that later. Type of merchant can often impact how a transaction is interchanged based on the merchant category code. The data being passed. When a transaction is passed, especially in business-to-business transactions, the type, amount, and level of data that is passed with the transaction through the system often has a direct impact on how the transaction is interchanged, as does certain specialized bin-based interchange programs. We'll talk a little about that in detail in a couple of minutes, but when you have specialized programs that are specific to certain bin ranges issued by an issuing bank, that's obviously going to have an impact on the interchange rate. The acquirer or processor's capabilities also will impact it. There are some processors that have different types of capabilities as others, certainly as it relates to business-to-business transactions. And the method by which the transaction is processed. Is it face-to-face? Is it card not present? Is it a quote-unquote push-pay transaction? Is it supplier-initiated? These things often impact how a transaction is interchanged as well. So let's talk a little more about that on the next slide, please. So the types of business-to-business cards and transactions. First, you have the traditional commercial cards. These were the first cards issued to really work with commercial transactions, commonly referred to walking plastic. An example would be a large corporation that issues cards to their employees that need to make payments out and about. So it could be everything from checking into a hotel to getting on a plane to buying some lunch to perhaps making some micropayments along the way, but they're typically done with actual plastic. The next type of transaction is a traditional ghost card, also referred to as an on-account type program. And this is when you have the 16 digits that are housed at the supplier, and they use those that number to make transactions when they are ready to process a transaction. So it's their customer, the buyer's card that sits in their account, and they make those transactions. Another type of ghost or static type of transaction is when you have a ghost card, but it can only be processed upon the buyer's approval. So while the supplier maintains that card data in their enterprise, they can only process a transaction once they receive the buyer's approval. Next type of card product is single-use virtual cards. These have become very popular in B2B commerce, and this essentially is a product where, while it's connected to a prime card account, each time a transaction takes place, a new 16 digits are spun up, and those digits can only be used for that one transaction, and in most cases for that exact amount of that transaction. This was a technology that was developed really to prevent some improper payments and other security elements because it's only used for that one transaction. And then lastly, buyer-initiated payments, also referred to as straight-through processed or push pay. This is when the purchaser has complete control over when that transaction is made, and they in fact hit that button and push that transaction to the supplier. Next slide, please, Rupert. So why is business to business so different from the consumer arena? First, the profile of the relationship is completely different. There are two basic types of transactions, and this is not intended to cover every type of transaction, but if you think of it in two broad categories, you have traditional P-card and T&E payments. These are typically transacted with walking plastic. They're typically used for indirect or non-core spend activities. An example of that would be, as I mentioned earlier, somebody from a large corporation checking into a hotel or making some type of payment that's not necessarily related directly to the core activities of that corporation. These transactions are typically used for payments under $5,000. There are a lot of exceptions to that. Some entities place various limits on what the amount could be. It could be as low as $100 or as high as $100,000 or whatever the case may be. But they're typically used for smaller payments. And they're typically processed like a consumer card payment would be processed. The second broad category of business-to-business transactions are what we refer to here at Boost as line of business spend. These are transactions that are typically handled with a virtual card product, either single-use or ghost cards. We're talking about transactions here for products or services that are core to the business. So let's say you have a manufacturer. An example would be that manufacturer purchasing screws that they can use to actually create the product that they're creating as their core business. They're often used for payments of all sizes. We see transactions literally into the millions of dollars. So there's typically no limit other than the limit that's been established between the corporate card holder and their issuing bank as far as the credit extension. And they're typically processed through virtual terminals or via a buyer-initiated payment or straight-through process. Next slide, please. So just continuing on with why business-to-business is different. Just generally, there is a tremendous difference between a vendor and vendee relationship and the risk profile of that transaction than the chance encounter between a consumer card holder and a retailer. You have existing business relationships with continuing personal relationships that may or may not be the case in a consumer environment. Typically, they're invoice-based and they're invoiced post the delivery of a product or a service versus cash and carry, which is very common in the consumer arena. And like all other types of payment methods, these entities often make adjustments via subsequent invoices. So even if there's an overpayment or an underpayment, they adjust for that in subsequent invoices because there is that continuing relationship. You know, unlike retailers that serve consumers, corporate suppliers do not typically have to accept cards. The whole notion of supplier enablement across a broad spectrum of suppliers is relatively new, and there's still a very large percentage of suppliers that do not currently take cards as a form of payment, and we'll get to that in a little bit as well. But there are reasons why they would elect to take cards, and three primary reasons. First, to remain competitive. Their customers may want to pay them with a card. In fact, some may demand that they pay with a card if they want to continue to do business with them. very often they can get paid quicker. That's one of the components that's often offered along with card acceptance, certainly when we're talking to suppliers on behalf of payers. And also to gain access to detailed remittance data. And this is becoming very, very important to suppliers, especially suppliers that have a high velocity of payments being made to them. The other thing is that suppliers are typically priced on an interchange plus basis, meaning that it's complete transparency to the supplier as to what the components of their cost is. Very often, certainly not always the case, retailers are charged a bundled rate where they don't see into the components of it. But for the most part, suppliers, especially larger ones, are priced on an interchange plus or completely transparent basis. Next slide, please. So what's been the problem? Why have, in certain cases, there been problems expanding card acceptance across a broader spectrum of suppliers? First of all, many suppliers operate on relatively small margins, and they either cannot or do not think they can, and that's key here because perception is often different than reality in this case. They don't think they can accept cards, so that's been a knee-jerk reaction to many suppliers thinking that card acceptance is much more expensive than it needs to be. Interchange rates don't always reflect the true economics between the trading partners. So one of the things we're going to get into momentarily is the flexibility of interchange rates and some special interchange rates that apply to business. But historically, there hasn't always been a direct connection between the economics and interchange rates. Remittance reporting has been less than stellar. And this is truly becoming very important as suppliers get more sophisticated ERP systems, as they rely more on the remittance data that they get and the need to be able to manage it. The ability for them to receive reports in a format that can be managed is becoming mission critical. The other reason is that virtual cards can often be cumbersome. For those entities that accept large amounts of virtual cards, it can often be very challenging for them to have to secure the card data and process the transactions manually. The other thing is the buyers often think that they don't have as much leverage as they actually do have in terms of dictating the payment method, that how they want to pay their supplier. Next slide, please. The other issue has been that suppliers do not want to have the sensitive card data within their enterprise, and this has really come to the forefront since some of the recent breaches over the last couple of years. Another reason why suppliers tend to either not take cards, or some of them, or perhaps even stop taking cards, is the promise to get paid quicker doesn't always materialize. We call that the double cross, when a supplier is promised they'll get paid quicker if they receive a credit card payment, but then over the course of a cycle or two, the payer gets lax and starts paying them at the older terms, and that often results in attrition with that particular supplier. I mentioned earlier some acquirers may or may not be able to process transactions properly, so there are suppliers that have issues with that. And the relationship between the ticket size and interchange, while it's still a cornerstone of many B2B interchange programs, and this is just my opinion, frankly, I think it needs to be reevaluated by all the card brands. Just as an example, if you have one supplier that's getting $100 million in spend with a $5,000 average ticket versus another supplier that's processing $2 million of spend but with a $50,000 average ticket, which supplier should have the lower rate? Should it be based on volume? Should it be based on average ticket? There are both sides of that discussion and debate. I think it needs to continue, and again, from my perspective, I'm not sure there should be a link between average ticket size and the rate itself. Next slide. So what's changed? Well, a lot of things have changed. First of all, there's been an introduction over the last several years of B2B specific interchange rates. Some are broad programs available to most industries. A couple of examples are level 3 large ticket rates introduced by MasterCard and Visa. There are other specialized programs, MasterCard Payment Gateway, MasterCard's Commercial Payments Account, the CPA program. Visa similarly has their Large Purchase Advantage program, the VLPA, and their STP program, which they recently launched. These are available to a broad spectrum of suppliers. They're primarily based on average ticket size, but they are available and they've had a meaningful impact on acceptance. And then there are industry-specific interchange rate programs that have really been introduced over the years. MasterCard just recently introduced a new healthcare-specific interchange rate that offers healthcare providers a deeply reduced rate program. And as early as the early 90s, supermarket rates were introduced to get supermarkets to agree to accept cards where they had not previously. So there are several programs like that, and they continue to be introduced. The other thing that's changed is issuers are generally warming up to the notion of lower interchange rates. It's not something they like. If given a preference, they would keep rates as they are. But the truth of the matter is they're realizing that it's no longer just a purely cannibalistic program where you can have certain types of payees that continue to pay the higher rates, but you may have certain suppliers where rates need to be adjusted downward. There's a willingness on the issuer's part also to renegotiate rebate deals with their customers. This is something that we're seeing more and more, and they're willing to ultimately receive less interchange revenue. Again, not something they prefer, but we're beginning to see issuers warm up to the notion that if they want to get some more specific spend cardable, it needs to be at a lower interchange rate and therefore low interchange revenue, if it's necessary. Next slide, please. So in addition, things that have changed on the landscape is on the buy side, the buyers are also beginning to realize that lower rebates may be required in order to get incremental card spend. So whereas they have really, in many ways, become to grow very happy about receiving very large rebates and have become used to it, they're also beginning to realize that there are certain categories of spend, certain categories of suppliers where there is likely to be a lower rebate. And we're seeing a lot more of those programs where you have issuers buying into that and realizing the reality. The other big change has been the technology front. There have been new technologies introduced that cure a lot of the pain points I mentioned earlier that are associated with the biggest component of commercial card payments, and that's virtual cards right now. There are platforms now that can actually transform email-based virtual card notifications into a buyer-initiated payment, which essentially takes away any call to action the supplier has to deploy. They become just the recipient of the payment, and they really don't have to do anything. It eliminates any exposure to card data in the enterprise, which I mentioned earlier is a big issue. They don't have to capture card data from various portals, and they don't have to manually process the payments. And in conjunction with some of these technologies, the suppliers can now receive remittance data in native formats, so that eliminates manual reconciliation and makes it a lot easier for them to manage that remittance data. And sometimes that's really important, especially, again, when you have the high velocity payments. Next slide, please. So this brings us to what's the big secret. And next slide, please. The big secret is that interchange rates are not engraved in stone. There are a host of programs, proprietary programs, specialized programs, published programs that are available to all suppliers and issuers, but those are not the only rates that can be structured. So why don't we go to the next page, and I'll tell you exactly what I mean. So sometimes even the lowest published rates, or the specialized interchange rate programs I had mentioned, just are not low enough. They can't get the job done. So whereas the overall value proposition may be solid to the suppliers, the payer may be willing to pay sooner, they may be able to get the data they need, they may like the automation process, but the rate is simply too high. Perhaps the margins are just too tight, or they just are not willing to accept cards unless the rate is lower. So if the issuer, the cardholder, the acquirer, supplier, and card brand are all in agreement and work together, proprietary rates can be established. It's in their hands. It's not only what that inch-and-a-half book of interchange rates that are published says has to be. There is flexibility to create proprietary rates. Now, just to be clear, it's not a simple process. It involves a lot of moving parts, but it may be well worth it if everybody agrees that it makes sense and everybody buys into it. The acquirer and processor needs to have the technical expertise to implement the development work that is required, and there is some work required with respect to their interface with the card brand and the interchange tables. And the process can take quite a while, up to even 180 days, maybe even longer, depending on who the players are and what's involved with the specific program. Next slide, please. So just to get a little more specific on this, there are three broad types of proprietary rate structures. The first are those that are referred to as MPPs or VPPs, MPP being MasterCard's program, partner program, and VPPs being Visa's. These are set up as global rates that are applied to most, if not all, bin ranges that are processed by that supplier through their acquirer or processor. So these are hard-coded for all customers. An example would be a utility that establishes, in conjunction with their acquirer and the brand, a rate that all of their customers, when any of their customers would pay, that would be the interchange rate that they would have to pay. These are not very common. They're typically used for very large companies, but they are out there, and it's a program that's been in place for a while, and it's one of the primary types of proprietary rate structures. The next are BSAs, or bilateral service agreements. Now this is unlike the global concept of an MPP or a VPP. These are rates that are established on a one-to-one relationship between a particular purchaser or buyer and a particular supplier. So in this case, you may have a relationship between a buyer and supplier where they agree to pay and accept cards, and a specific rate is set up just for that one-to-one relationship. So that too is it's not a simple process. It can take a meaningful amount of time, and again, the acquirer and processor need to be up to speed and capable of handling that BSA, which most are, by the way. The third is a mid-base proprietary rate. So this is where you have the ability to set up a supplier to a supplier to receive an established rate across a pre-selected group of card types. So for instance, you can have a supplier just one mid to accept cards, let's say all US issued commercial credit and debit cards. You could set up that supplier so that for just certain types of cards that come in, that would be the rate that they would pay. And the reason why I'm drawing a delineation between that and MPP and VPPs is that supplier can have multiple mids, some of which could be just interchanged at published rates. Some could perhaps be subject to a BSA or even an MPP. This would be a very mid-specific setup for just certain pre-selected commercial cards across a broad base of buyers to be interchanged at that particular rate. Like MPPs and BSAs, a mid-base proprietary rate requires the issuer opt-in, meaning that the issuer must agree to participate in the program. When you have published rates, issuers and acquirers alike, obviously, all are made fully aware of any rate structures that are being put out in that release. When you get into proprietary mid-based rates, the issuer community may not be made aware of those specific arrangements. So it's very important that if you set up a mid-based proprietary rate structure, that the issuers that are going to issue the cards to the payers must opt into the program. Very, very important. Next slide, please. So just to wrap up some final thoughts. First, proprietary interchange rates can and should be used, I refer to it as surgically, in conjunction with published rates and a well thought out and executed supplier enablement program. They shouldn't be used indiscriminately. They shouldn't be used without a tremendous amount of thought and strategy put into it. It's really very important. It's also important to understand that rebates are just one of the benefits of paying with a card, right? So when you're talking to a payer about possibly getting involved with one of these proprietary programs, it's important to understand that there are other benefits they would enjoy in utilizing a card, like a working capital extension and eliminating the costs associated with paper checks and the postage. What this allows us to do is create a compelling conversation with a supplier that has historically rejected card acceptance because of cost, right? So where they may have had some concerns of cost and have rejected it, we can now go to them with a complete package, including reduced cost, data, security, and automation. It just changes the conversation now with suppliers. It's imperative that you partner up with an acquirer that's familiar with the B2B landscape and the proprietary interchange rate arena. And it's also absolutely critical that all of the stakeholders involved are completely aligned. This is not something that can be handled unilaterally. All the players need to be involved. And lastly, I would encourage all the stakeholders to always think out of the box. The beauty of having this flexibility with these rates and a host of other benefits that are out there in the commercial card world is that you can really expand acceptance if you think way out of the box and think creatively. There's a lot of different ways to cut it now, and between the revised rate structures and technology, like I said, there's a completely different conversation that can now take place with the supplier community. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Rupert. That's all of the prepared comments that I was going to make today. Rupert, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you very much, Dean. Thank you very much indeed. Now, please, everybody, some people have got their hands up. If you could type your questions, I will read them through out to Dean. And we've got one question that's repeated twice already, and the answer is yes. The question is, can you get a copy of the slides? And what we will do afterwards is that we will send through to everyone that attended this presentation a PDF copy of the slide deck. So those are the two questions we've got so far. So if anyone has a question they'd like to raise, please type into the question box your question. If you think of it later, then simply email me at Eurofinance and Rupert Keenlyside at eurofinance.com, and I will bring you in. Dean, we have a couple of people with their hands up. What I'll do is I'm going to bring some people in, as we seem to be having. James Diaz, you have your hand up, and you're online now. Okay, I've muted James Diaz because this is okay. Here's one, a question. From a supplier perspective, can you selectively accept cards from some B2B customers and not from others? Does this contravene any selective card acceptance rules?
That's an answer that's really best answered by reviewing the operating rules of the brands that apply. The brands do have a variety of rules relating to acceptance and selective acceptance, and I would suggest that you refer to those operating rules.
Okay, the next question. To what extent are proprietary rates, brackets off-table, currently used only with very large suppliers? So to what extent are proprietary rates the ones that aren't on the table currently used?
It's very new. It's a very new program. You're beginning to see more and more suppliers interested in exploring card acceptance. There are some industries that are broadly undergoing a reevaluation of card acceptance, and there's been some attrition in some industries based largely on rate. And we're now having conversations with some of those leading players in those industries about reconsidering card acceptance to the extent they've attrited already under new rate structures. We're regularly putting together programs typically for larger suppliers where you have a high velocity of payments, you have large amounts of payments, so the volume is pretty significant, where they frankly can demand a lower rate structure. And you know, as rates generally become more transparent to the supplier community, I think you're going to see a lot more of that. But for the most part, the proprietary rates have really been established for the larger customer base.
Okay, and the next question is, how do you find the brand's willingness to negotiate special rates for clients? What criteria do they watch mostly in their assessment?
Well, I would say that the primary question is, will this supplier accept cards in the absence of a discounted rate structure, right? So that's often the first question. And if the answer is no, they will not, that obviously gets their thought process going. But for the most part, it's based on volume. It's based on the leverage between the parties. It's based on the perception of whether or not they will lose the ability to pay with the card if they do not agree to a reduced interchange program. So there's a lot of different factors that go into that blender, most of which are pretty commonsensical, but very often it's a simple decision of, if we don't do this, are we still going to be able to use cards?
Okay, well, this is your last chance to ask questions, everybody, although if you email me, I'd be very happy to forward anything to Dean, and I'm sure we could exchange the information electronically. Dean will be speaking at our CPI Global Commercial Card and Payment Summit in October in the Roosevelt Hotel, New York City. You're all very welcome. I'll be there as well. And the subject of interchange and the future of interchange is a key part of the debate there. Dean is going to be speaking on our B2B supplier enablement panel. This presentation will be available as a recording, and we will be emailing you a PDF copy of it shortly. Thank you, Dean, very much for a very interesting presentation, and thank you, everybody, for taking the time to listen to Dean's CPI expert briefing. Goodbye.
Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.
And have a great day.